Welcome to Geekstorians, the show that excavates the stories behind the stories. The industrial decisions, the cultural pivots, the moments where everything nearly collapsed, and what people built out of the wreckage. Season 2 of Geekstorians is built around a single observation. Geek culture doesn't thrive because it's well run. It thrives because it's resilient. Because the people and the properties inside of it refuse to disappear, even when every institutional force is trying to make them. Today's episode is about a film that should never have existed, and about a catastrophe so total, so public, and so magnificently humiliating that it accidentally cleared the ground for one of the most significant pieces of popular cinema of the 21st century. This is The Dark Knight Didn't Have to Exist. June 1997. You're in a cinema. The lights go down. You've been a Batman fan since 1989. You sat through Batman Forever 2 years ago and made your peace with it. It wasn't Burton, but it was fine. Val Kilmer was fine. Jim Carrey was a lot. But fine. You're still here. You're committed. The Warner Brothers logo. A sweeping orchestral score. And then... nipples.
Huh?
Not subtle ones either. Not maybe the sculpture got carried away. These are deliberate, architectural. The kind of design decision that suggests someone, somewhere, held a meeting and said, what if Batman, but anatomically correct? What if Gotham's greatest detective needed a sports bra? You file this away and push on. Maybe it gets better. It does not get better. There's Robin, Chris O'Donnell, who was already too old for the role in Batman Forever and is now somehow 2 years older, wearing what is very clearly Nightwing's costume while still insisting he's Robin.
Chicks dig the car.
There's Batgirl, introduced as Alfred's niece because nobody apparently saw a reason to make her Barbara Gordon.
Suit me up, Uncle Alfred.
There's Bane, one of Batman's most genuinely terrifying villains in the comics, the man who broke the Bat's back in one of the most iconic story arcs of the 1990s. Reduced here to a mute, gurgling henchman who appears to have been accidentally assembled from spare parts. And there's Mr. Freeze, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Nice to meet you.
For a reported $25 million. Delivering a performance built almost entirely around ice puns. Ice to meet you. Chill out. Allow me to break the ice. Cold shoulder. There are approximately 47 of them. Someone actually counted.
Tonight, hell freezes over.
And Gotham City itself, once a gothic nightmare, now looks like Las Vegas after 3 cans of Red Bull. You walk out of that cinema in the summer of 1997 with one clear thought. What on earth just happened to Batman? What happened, it turned out, was one of the most useful disasters in the history of superhero cinema. To understand what Batman and Robin destroyed, you have to understand what Tim Burton built. 1989, Batman. Michael Keaton in the cape, Jack Nicholson as the Joker. And a Gotham City that looked less like a real American metropolis and more like what would happen if German Expressionism and Art Deco had a very dark, very expensive argument. Burton was not a superhero fan. He was a Gothic fantasist, the director of Beetlejuice and Pee-wee's Big Adventure. And he approached Batman as a character study in psychological strangeness. His Bruce Wayne was damaged, haunted, not a power fantasy, but a man whose entire identity had been forged by trauma, and who had chosen to process that trauma by dressing as a bat and punching criminals. Which, as it turns out, is exactly what audiences wanted. Batman made over $400 million worldwide, The bat symbol was everywhere, on t-shirts, on toys, on a Prince soundtrack that remains one of the strangest musical footnotes in superhero cinema. It proved once and for all that superhero films didn't need to be camp or simple or pitched at children. It could be dark, it could be strange, it could have something on its mind.
I'm Batman.
Then came Batman Returns in 1992, and Burton, now with more creative control and less studio interference, made something stranger and darker and considerably more unsettling. Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman was practically feral, licking milk out of a saucer and stalking Gotham like a leather-clad housecat with unresolved issues. Danny DeVito's Penguin was a grotesque sewer creature who looked less like a comic book villain and more like something Tim Burton had found living under the studio lot. The film opened with an infant being thrown into a river in a wicker basket. It contained a scene where he bit off a man's nose. This was not, strictly speaking, the tone normally associated with a summer blockbuster that also sells toys. Children were taken to see it expecting a superhero film and left with questions their parents weren't prepared to answer. McDonald's, who had tied a Happy Meal promotion to the film, pulled it mid-run. They had committed to what they thought was a children's property and received something that felt like a fever dream about class, abandonment, and the cruelty of the beautiful. Their feedback to Warner Brothers was politely expressed and absolutely non-negotiable. No. And at Warner Brothers, someone did the math. Batman Returns had made $267 million worldwide. Respectable, but significantly less than the first film. The marketing tie-ins had been a disaster, and the film that was supposed to serve a family-friendly franchise had sent children home traumatized. The conclusion was not, Tim Burton makes challenging adult films and perhaps this franchise should be managed accordingly. The conclusion was, Tim Burton makes films that are too dark, too weird, and too difficult to sell Happy Meals with it. And so Warner Brothers made a decision. They kept the franchise, they removed the director. Tim Burton stayed attached as a producer, nominally, but creative control passed elsewhere. Their replacement was Joel Schumacher, who had made a name for himself with slick, commercially reliable films. St. Elmo's Fire, The Lost Boys, A Time to Kill. He was competent, professional, good with actors, and crucially, willing to make the film Warner Brothers actually wanted. And the question of what that film was supposed to be leads to the most revealing story of the entire saga. Joel Schumacher did not wake up one morning and decide to destroy Batman. Joel Schumacher was doing exactly what Warner Brothers asked him to: make Batman bigger, brighter, louder, and above all, more toyetic. That word, toyetic, is one of the most important and least discussed words in Hollywood history. It means designed to generate toy sales. It's the aesthetic of the action figure. Distinctive silhouette, bright colours, interchangeable accessories, multiple variants. It is not, as it turns out, a particularly good framework for dramatic storytelling, but it is an excellent framework for toy catalogues. Batman had been a merchandising machine since Burton's first film. In some categories, the licensing revenue dwarfed the box office, and they watched Batman Returns lose money on Happy Meals, whilst deciding that the franchise needed to serve that commercial infrastructure more directly. Michael Keaton, reading the direction Schumacher was taking with the material, turned down a reported $15 million to return. He understood what the script was trying to be, and decided it wasn't for him.
Nope.
So Val Kilmer stepped in.
I'm Batman.
Batman Forever was brighter, faster, louder. Jim Carrey as a genuinely unhinged Riddler. Tommy Lee Jones doing what can only be described as a barely controlled interpretation of Two-Face, and a Gotham that had abandoned Burton's expressionist shadows for a neon-drenched theme park. It was, by many measures, a lesser film than its predecessors. But it made $336 million worldwide, which is a massive commercial rebound, significantly ahead of Batman Returns, and closing in on the 1989 original. And that's where things went wrong. Not with failure, but with success. Because Warner Brothers looked at Batman Forever's numbers and drew the logical but catastrophic conclusion. The formula works. Go further. More villains, more colour, more toys, bigger stars, more merchandise tie-ins, more of everything that made this profitable. At this point, the franchise wasn't being written like a film. It was being assembled like a product line. The new film would have Mr. Freeze and Poison Ivy as its headline villains, plus Bane as a third, although Bane's casting tells you everything you need to know about the priorities at work. In the comics, Bane is one of the most formidable adversaries Batman has ever faced. A tactician, a man who, in the 1993 story arc Nightfall, methodically broke Batman's spirit before breaking his spine. Brought to the screen in 1997, he was a mute, lumbering henchman with 4 lines of dialogue and who looked like he'd lost a fight with a Halloween costume shop. Gotham had become less crime-ridden nightmare and more theme park that sells glow sticks. Warner Brothers wanted a visual. They got a visual. What they discarded was the character. And then there's the question of Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Let's kick some ice.
Schwarzenegger received a reported $25 million salary to play Mr. Freeze, with contractual requirements around close-ups and a major share of the promotional campaign. His performance was built almost entirely around ice puns. This did not come from Joel Schumacher's creative vision. It came from the logic of casting the biggest action star in the world and building the marketing campaign around him. Schumacher has spoken candidly about the experience. He was navigating a system in which the toy approval process had as much influence on the design decisions as the director. The batsuits, the ones with the nipples, they were not the result of bold aesthetic choices by somebody with a strong vision. They were approved through the studio's production pipeline like everything else. Schumacher had defended them because he was the director and that was his job. When the film was released in June 1997, the reviews were brutal. And the audiences, who had shown up reliably for every Batman film since 1989, largely didn't. Critics didn't just dislike Batman and Robin. They treated it like a public service announcement about what happens when a franchise loses adult supervision. In the aftermath, critics and fans reached for the nearest available explanation. Some questioned whether Schumacher had ever seen previous versions of Batman at all. Others landed on a more specific theory, that his reference point was the 1966 Adam West TV series, known to fans as Batman 66. Which would at least explain some of the camp aesthetic. The primary colours, the rubber villains, the general sense that everyone involved was in on the joke and the audience hadn't been told. It's an understandable conclusion, the similarities are right there on screen. But Schumacher denied it directly. He said the 66 show was never in his thinking. And the more you consider it, the more that distinction does matter. Because Batman 66 wasn't cynically manufactured camp. It was a genuine product of its era. By 1966, the Comics Code Authority had spent over a decade scrubbing the darkness out of superhero comics. That lighter, more playful Batman wasn't a betrayal of the character, it was the character at the time as the comics had shaped him. The show reflected that faithfully. Batman and Robin was something different. It took a character who had spent 8 years moving back towards darkness and psychological weight and dragged him in the opposite direction. Not because the material called for it, but because the toy catalogue did. The resemblance to Batman 66 isn't a homage, it's a coincidence with a paper trail.
Holy paper trail Batman.
Batman and Robin made $107 million domestically. For a film budgeted at $125 million, with a further substantial marketing spend, and with a studio that had spent years building a merchandising infrastructure around the franchise, that number was more than just disappointing. And so Warner Brothers did something Hollywood almost never does. It stopped. The franchise didn't die with a dramatic announcement. There were no press conferences, no official statements, no moment where somebody stood up and said, "This is over." Just a gradual, institutional withdrawal. Schumacher had already been developing the next film, a project fans later dubbed Batman Triumphant. The writer, Mark Protasevich, called it Batman Unchained, and was never quite sure where the triumphant came from. The project had real momentum. Protasevich, who would later go on to write Thor and I Am Legend, had a 150-page outline. Schumacher even visited the set of Face Off to approach Nicolas Cage about playing the Scarecrow. Casting conversations were happening, and the script, for what it's worth, was genuinely interesting. Scarecrow would have developed a fear toxin and used it on Bruce Wayne, sending Batman into an extended hallucination sequence in which every villain from the previous 4 films returned. Nicholson's Joker, Pfeiffer's Catwoman, DeVito's Penguin, Carey's Riddler, Tommy Lee Jones's Two-Face. A reckoning with Batman's past, staged as a fever dream. The secondary villain would have been Harley Quinn, reimagined here as the Joker's daughter seeking revenge. Courtney Love and Madonna were those being considered for the role. The film would have ended with Bruce Wayne in Bali, standing in a cave full of bats, finally conquering his fear. Schumacher said it would have been very dark, a deliberate course correction. He'd already told journalists he felt he had disappointed a lot of long-time fans by being too conscious of the family aspect, and that he owed them a different kind of Batman film. The way that potential film died is almost more revealing than anything in Batman and Robin itself. Przejevic delivered his draft to Warner Brothers executive Tom Lassery. Lassery went quiet. Days passed. Then weeks. Calls went unreturned. Przejevic's agent chased. Nothing. No meeting. No notes. No formal response of any kind. Eventually, the message came back through intermediaries. Warner Brothers was pulling the plug. They were going to wait and see what they were going to do with Batman. The Schumacher-driven Batman train, as Przejevich put it, had been taken off the rails. Not with a conversation or a decision, just with silence. For 8 years, Batman became the most expensive object in Hollywood that nobody wanted to touch. Scripts circulated, reboots were pitched, directors flirted with the idea and then quietly walked away. The franchise wasn't dead, but it was quarantined. Batman wasn't gone, he was simply waiting for someone brave enough to touch the film franchise again. And this part of the story deserves more attention than it usually gets. Because during those 8 years, from 1997 to 2005, Batman didn't disappear from the culture. He was alive and well, just not on cinema screens. Batman the Animated Series, which had launched in 1992, had done something remarkable. With producer Bruce Timm and writer Paul Dini, the show took Batman somewhere neither Burton nor Schumacher had quite managed. Genuinely great storytelling. Tight, noir-influenced, psychologically sophisticated. Then it did something the films hadn't. It created a character that didn't exist yet.
Hi, Puddin'.
Harley Quinn first appeared in the 1992 episode Joker's Favour, a character Paul Dini invented specifically for the show with no comic book precedent. She wasn't adapted from the page, she was created from scratch, and the audience response was so immediate and overwhelming that DC began publishing her in the comics the following year, a character born in animation, adopted by the source material. The animated series didn't just honour Batman's mythology, it added to it. The same series produced Heart of Ice, an episode that won an Emmy Award and gave Mr. Freeze his chronological tragic backstory, transforming a campy villain into a genuinely heartbreaking figure of Shakespearean dimensions. The same Mr. Freeze that Arnold Schwarzenegger played for $25 million in Batman and Robin. The contrast was not lost on anyone. Meanwhile, the comics were doing their own extraordinary work in the franchise's cinema exile years. The Long Halloween, Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale's 12-issue noir epic from 1996 to 1997, traced Batman's early career through Gotham's criminal underworld with the texture of a great crime novel. No Man's Land in 1999 imagined Gotham cut off from the United States after a catastrophic earthquake, a year-long crossover of genuine ambition and scale. And Hush in 2002, a game from Loeb with art by Jim Lee, became one of the best-selling Batman stories of its era. These weren't consolation prizes, they were proof that Batman was a character capable of sustaining serious, ambitious storytelling. The films had failed, the character had not. Hollywood did eventually remember that Batman existed, just not as fast as you'd think. The development history of Batman between Schumacher and Nolan is a remarkable catalogue of near misses, and one project that deserves a moment on its own, because it illuminates just how lost the franchise really was. Darren Aronofsky, the director of Requiem for a Dream and Pi, was attached to adapt Frank Miller's Batman Year One. Miller himself was brought in to write the script, and what he produced was so radically different from the source material that it barely shared a title with it. In Miller's script, Bruce Wayne loses his fortune after his parents' murder and becomes homeless. Alfred is reimagined as Little Al, a black mechanic who runs an auto repair shop and becomes Bruce's mentor. The Batmobile is a modified car from Little Al's garage. The Batcave is an abandoned subway station. The film would have been rated R. The version of Batman that emerged from this process was unrecognisable from any previous incarnation. Grimy, urban, stripped of all mythology. It never got made, Warner Brothers passed, which, with the benefit of hindsight, was probably the right call, although not necessarily for the reasons anyone was articulating at the time. The franchise didn't need reinvention so radical it erased the character. It needed someone who understood why the character worked in the first place. And then, almost unbelievably, the rescue plan came from a director whose previous film was about memory loss. Christopher Nolan came to Batman from a direction Warner Brothers had not traditionally looked. His debut film Following had been made in 1998 with a crew of friends, equipment that he didn't own, and a budget in the low thousands. It was a technically accomplished noir thriller that attracted enough attention to get him a meeting about his next film. That next film was Memento. Memento was made for approximately $9 million. It ran in reverse chronological order, demanding active engagement from its audience and treating the viewer as intelligent adults capable of piecing together a complex narrative without being walked through it. It made over $40 million worldwide, received 2 Academy Award nominations, and established Nolan as a filmmaker of genuine significant talent. He followed it with Insomnia, a studio film, bigger budget, Al Pacino and Robin Williams, which demonstrated that he could work inside the Hollywood system without surrendering the things that made his work distinctive. By 2003, he was exactly the kind of director studios approached when they wanted to hand someone a dead franchise and see what happens. Commercially reliable enough to be trusted with a large project, artistically credible enough to attract talent, and not yet so established that he could demand total control without negotiation. Warner Brothers came to him with Batman, and the conversation that followed was, by all accounts, the opposite of the one that had produced Batman and Robin. No mandate about toy lines, no requirements about villain close-ups, no discussion about promotional obligations tied to salary, no one asking whether the Batsuit should have nipples. And the reason for this freedom was not enlightenment, it was desperation. Warner Brothers had a franchise that had been dormant for 8 years. The last film had been a critical and commercial disaster of spectacular proportions. The property had cultural value. Batman was still Batman, people still cared. But the film brand had been so comprehensively destroyed that there was essentially no expectation left to manage. It was almost impossible to make a Batman film that performed worse than Batman and Robin. And that's an unusual creative position to be in. Nolan went back to the source material, specifically Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli's Batman Year One, the 1987 reinvention of the character's origin, and to Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale's The Long Halloween. He wanted to tell the story of where Batman came from, not the gadgets or the rogue gallery and not the mythology, but the specific human question of why a man would decide to put on a costume and go looking for criminals in the dark. The resulting film, Batman Begins, released in June 2005, wasn't an immediate blockbuster. It made $374 million worldwide, which was solid but not transformative. The reviews were strong. The reaction to Batman fans was largely relief verging on disbelief. Somebody had made a serious Batman film again. No neon statues, no ice puns, or anatomically detailed batsuits. The franchise had not just been rebooted, it had been quietly and carefully rebuilt from the foundation up. But the story of why The Dark Knight exists, the film, not the character, actually begins with a casting decision that almost nobody understood. When Warner Brothers announced in 2006 that Heath Ledger had been cast as the Joker in a sequel to Batman Begins, the internet reaction was immediate, loud, and almost entirely negative. Heath Ledger was known for romantic dramas, Brokeback Mountain, Casanova, A Knight's Tale, if you're feeling generous about what was seen as the scope of his range at that point. He was a serious actor, broadly liked, but not someone whose career had suggested he was the right fit for one of the most iconic villains in the history of popular culture. The Joker, in the cultural imagination, belonged to specific performers: Cesar Romero's camp perfection, Jack Nicholson's theatrical menace, Mark Hamill's definitive animated voice, a performance so compelling that even people who'd never seen the animated series knew what it sounded like. These were actors who brought an outsized theatrical quality to the role, a performance style that matched the character's chaos. Ledger, by contrast, was known for stillness, for the kind of performance that draws inward rather than projecting outward. The casting seemed to many people simply wrong, but Ledger threw himself into the preparation with an intensity that has since become part of the film's mythology. He kept a production diary, documenting the character's internal logic and psychology. He worked with Nolan extensively to develop a Joker who wasn't the theatrical showman of earlier incarnations, but something more genuinely disturbing, a person who had decided at some fundamental level that the rules simply didn't apply and that chaos was not just a tactic but a philosophy. The costume was partly Ledger's own idea. The makeup design emerged from conversations with Nolan about what a real person who wore that face might look like, and the answer was something grotesque and human rather than theatrical and stylized. Ledger died in January 2008, 6 months before the film's release. He was 28 years old. The coroner's ruling was accidental overdose from a combination of prescription medications, sleeping pills and anti-anxiety drugs prescribed for insomnia he'd developed. The family has said they don't believe the Joker role was a factor. Nolan has never suggested otherwise. There has been enormous public speculation about a connection, but it has never been supported by any evidence. What's true is that a brilliant 28-year-old actor died way too soon. Everything else is just projection. The Dark Knight came out in July 2008. It made over $1 billion worldwide. The franchise Warner Brothers had nearly destroyed a decade earlier had just become the most successful superhero film ever made. And then came the nominations. 8 Academy Award nominations. Let that sink in for a moment, because superhero films simply were not taken seriously by the Academy. Not in the categories that counted. Visual effects, sound design, those were the ceiling. Spider-Man 2, widely considered the best superhero film before Nolan's trilogy, had picked up nominations in those categories. That was expected. That was the box superhero films lived in. The Dark Knight received nominations for film editing and cinematography, categories that said this is not just a technical achievement in a genre we tolerate. This is a film we are evaluating alongside other films. And Heath Ledger won Best Supporting Actor posthumously, only the second posthumous acting Oscar in the Academy's history. The Academy, which had spent decades treating superhero cinema as a category beneath serious consideration, gave its highest acting award to a man playing a comic book villain. The ceiling had not just been raised, it had been removed. The legacy of The Dark Knight is complicated by the fact that it's now so embedded in the cultural furniture that it's difficult to see clearly. But try to remember what superhero cinema looked like in 2007, the year before it came out. Marvel was preparing to launch the cinematic universe with Iron Man, a film about a character so B-list that studio executives had spent years dismissing him as unfilmable. DC had Batman Begins, which had restored some credibility, and Superman Returns, which, despite its best efforts, had largely failed to ignite. The prevailing critical view of superhero films was a kind of tolerant condescension. Commercial products, event cinema, big, loud machines designed to generate opening weekend numbers and sequels, not as a category serious cinema. The Dark Knight changed that framing in a single summer. Not because it was the first good superhero film. Batman Begins had been good, and Spider-Man 2 before it, and plenty of others in their own registers. But because it was good in a way that critical establishment couldn't ignore or condescend to. It was a crime film that happened to involve a man in a cape, and the crime film was extraordinary. Studios began to understand that superhero films were not a lesser category of cinema. They were a canvas, one that could carry ambition, complexity, and general artistic achievement, if the people making them were allowed to pursue those things. There's an irony here that's worth exploring for a moment. In 1997, the same year Batman and Robin drove DC's biggest franchise off a cliff, Marvel was clawing its way out of bankruptcy and watching Blade go into production. That film, as we covered in this season's 4th episode, became the unlikely proof of concept for the entire superhero film era that followed. Marvel had nothing. DC had everything, and DC detonated it. The Dark Knight, a decade later, was DC's answer, not to Marvel but to its own history. Proof that the damage could be repaired, that a franchise so comprehensively destroyed it needed 8 years of silence to recover could, in the right hands and with the right conditions, produce something not just commercially viable but genuinely great. And it proves something about the structure of the industry that Season 2 has been circling all along. The creative freedom that made The Dark Knight possible was not the result of good planning. It was the result of catastrophic failure. Warner Brothers didn't hand Nolan a blank canvas because they believed in auteur filmmaking. They handed it to him because the franchise was so damaged that there was nothing left to protect. No existing template to defend or established tone to maintain. No merchandising infrastructure that needed serving. The conditions for artistic freedom arrived through institutional failure. Which is, generally, exactly how the best things in this culture usually happen. Not because someone planned it, but because someone was brave enough or desperate enough to try something different with the wreckage. The strangest part of this story isn't that The Dark Knight was brilliant. The strangest part of this story is that it only exists because in 1997, Batman had nipples. I'm Dave from Geektown, and this has been Geekstorians. If you enjoyed this show, you can find more over at geektown.co.uk. And if you haven't already, go and check out Geektown Radio, our other podcast which covers TV, film and gaming news every week. You can also like and subscribe to both Geekstorians and Geektown Radio wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, sometimes the most valuable thing a franchise can have is a crater.